When Pedro, a cowboy hardened by life on the ranch, faced Mayare, a brave Apache woman, he never imagined that a struggle for survival would unleash an unexpected passion amid deadly dangers, secrets from the past, and the relentless law of the West. Both would discover that attraction could be as dangerous as any enemy. A story of adventure, romance, and tension that will change their lives forever. The sun fell relentlessly over the prairie, illuminating the Mercer Ranch with a harsh, white light. Less than 100 meters away, Mayar, a strong and brave Apache woman, was tied to a fallen tree, her wrists and waist bound by a clean rope, too new to be from the ranch. The wind swept through the pale, dry grass, carrying the scent of dusty earth. The tree seemed to have fallen years ago, its roots ripped out like a warning. Mayare lay there, her clothes torn, her belly pronounced under sweat and dirt clinging to her skin. She was not hiding. Her position was deliberate, planned for someone to find her and take note. Pedro, a 49-year-old widowed rancher with experience, rode along the path bordering the Mercer property. His horse stopped on its own at the scene. The leather saddle creaked under his weight. The Mercer Ranch remained silent behind her, the barn doors closed, the house still, as if no one lived there or no one wanted to be seen. The mill wheels sighed slowly and tiredly. Pedro dismounted, feeling the dry earth crunch under his boots as he kept his eyes fixed on the rope. "Please don't do this." Mayare's voice was weak and exhausted, yet clear. It was not a scream but a whisper, revealing that this had happened before. Pedro removed his hat and placed it on a fence post, letting her see him. He put the canteen a few steps away without bringing it closer. "I am not here to hurt you," he said firmly. His eyes, attentive and cautious, scanned first Pedro and then the house, evaluating every shadow. Pedro moved slowly, unhurried, aware of the tension filling the air. As he approached, the rope appeared new, not the worn ranch line. He knelt beside the fallen tree, feeling the rough bark on his knees, and slowly slid his knife under the rope. Mayare held her breath. She did not whisper. "I will free you," Pedro said calmly, asking her for patience as he cut. The fibers resisted, tense, as if reminding him not to let go too soon. Finally, when the rope gave way, her arms fell heavily, as if forgetting how to move. She curled into herself, one hand protecting her belly. Pedro stepped back, respecting her space, not touching her, watching attentively and carefully. What worried him most was not the way she was tied, but the rope itself, too clean, too bought in the city. As he let her drop, he noticed boot prints around the tree, deep, as if someone had waited for the show. Every detail confirmed the intentionality of the act. He stood and looked toward the house again, no movement, no sound, only the mill continuing its slow creak. "What is your name?" he asked softly. She swallowed and replied, "Mayare." Pedro nodded, pronouncing her name with respect. "I am Pedro." She remained silent, looking at the house behind the trees. Pedro took off his coat and placed it over the trunk, close enough for her to reach. She hesitated for a moment. Then she wrapped it around her shoulders, a small but considerate gesture. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, shivered, and shook her head. Pedro did not lift her. Instead, he tended to his cart, placing blankets and securing the horse, giving dignity where he could. The rope kept hammering in his mind, a constant reminder. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the Mercer Ranch mixed with dust and hay. She spoke in a flat voice, saying she belonged to her husband. Pedro looked at her, waiting. "My husband," continued Mayare. Pedro asked no more. He knew none of this was random. Every detail had been planned to send a message. Mayare nodded, acknowledging the unspoken truth. Pedro spoke softly. "People will see it. This will end the rumors." He climbed onto the cart seat, holding the reins as the ranch fell behind in unsettling silence. The thought that her husband had left her so close disturbed him deeply. Keeping his gaze forward, Pedro reflected on the implications of the rope and Mercer's intent. The cart moved forward unhurriedly. Pedro remained calm as the shadows of the ranch faded. Mayare rested on the blankets, lying on her side, hand over her belly, protecting what she carried inside. They passed a dry creek and a stretch of fence with twisted posts, a sign of known territory. The kind of fence no one fixes because everyone knows who it belongs to. Mercer land. Pedro could not ignore how close everything seemed. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked. She nodded slightly. He reached for a piece of bread and jerky, unwrapping it slowly so as not to frighten her. She ate carefully, like someone accustomed to little. They arrived at Pedro's ranch as the sun began to lose strength, softening the blazing heat. It was not a luxurious place. Low house, crooked barn, but solid, corral patched 1,000 times. The welcome was simple, but there was peace. Pedro helped her down without lifting her, holding her elbow to guide her. Inside, he placed a chair by the table and filled a cup with water. Mayare drank slowly, regaining her breath. "You are safe here tonight," Pedro said. "Only for the night," she repeated, as if she did not trust promises beyond that. He nodded firmly, offering temporary security. He sat across from her, watching carefully. Every movement of Mayare revealed strength and caution, a silent resistance Pedro deeply respected. The ranch was quiet, the wind moving the grass like a whisper. Everything seemed still, but Pedro felt the tension floating, ready to erupt at any moment. Time passed slowly as she settled, still wearing Pedro's coat over her shoulders. Her breathing became deeper and uneven. Pedro noticed the fragility and strength in Mayare's posture, a contrast that spoke of resilience and determination in someone who had survived too much. Hank had become Pedro, protective and attentive, aware of every shadow, every sound that could threaten the fragile calm. Night fell slowly, and the stillness was barely a veil over the latent tension. Every gesture, every glance carried understanding and mutual respect. Outside, the wind moved the dry leaves as Pedro observed the cut rope on the ground. The evidence of the threat persisted, a reminder that Mayare's safety was still not guaranteed. He was determined not to leave her alone, at least until she was completely safe. Silence became almost tangible. Heavy with the recent history of violence and threat, Pedro remained firm and patient, understanding that trust was earned through every action, every care. Night enveloped the ranch, promising temporary security and a necessary respite. Mayare lowered her head, resting her hands on her belly, as Pedro watched from a respectful distance. There was in her a mixture of fear and resilience that moved him, and something stirred in him, an instinct of protection beyond mere courtesy. Pedro understood that the struggle was not over. The threat remained, invisible but present. Every shadow, every creaking of wood, every whisper of the wind could be a warning. Yet Mayare's determination and his own created a silent bond, an alliance strengthened with every minute. The wind calmed for a moment, and Pedro allowed himself a breath. His gaze swept over the ranch, the hills, the prairie stretching to the horizon. Mayare remained silently by his side, but with a presence that spoke louder than words. The tension of the afternoon began to ease, leaving room for trust. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe using the button below. Also, turn on the notification bell and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. Night thickened slowly over Pedro's ranch, covering the hills with long shadows. Mayare remained near the fireplace, hugging her knees while Pedro checked the stable. Every creak of the wood reminded them of the vulnerability surrounding them. The fire cast flickers across her face, revealing scars of the past and the determination that defined her. Pedro watched in silence, noticing how the tension and fatigue of recent hours had left visible marks, though she fought to maintain an upright posture. Outside, the wind moved the dry grass like waves. The sounds of the night prairie reached them clearly, hooting owls, a distant coyote, and the brush of the fence rope in the wind. Every sound kept Pedro alert, vigilant by instinct. Pedro let Mayare settle in front of the fireplace, handing her a thick blanket. He sat beside her, keeping a prudent distance. Yet proximity forced inevitable contact, the tension in the air palpable, mixing respect and something deeper, unspoken. He finally spoke, in a low, measured voice. I can't promise that everything will be safe tomorrow, he said. She nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. Mayare knew the strength of the ranch lands and the fragility of the safety they offered. Her gaze lost itself in the flames, reflective. Pedro looked at the horizon through the broken window, observing the silhouette of the mountain. He could see how the moonlight caressed the prairie and how each shadow seemed to hide secrets. The threat from Mercer still hovered over them like an invisible but present specter. He tried to change the subject, softening the tension. "Where did you learn to move like that on the prairie?" asked Mayare. He sighed, showing a slight smile that softened his hardened features. Apache life had taught him to survive and anticipate others' movements. Pedro nodded, acknowledging the strength radiating from her. It was not just resilience, it was knowledge of the land, of the winds, of how life could change in an instant. He felt drawn to that mixture of vulnerability and silent power. The barn clock, old and rickety, ticked barely audibly. Every sound seemed to stretch time, making the wait almost unbearable. Pedro could not help feeling the need to protect her, even though he knew he must respect her space and autonomy. The night advanced, and the conversation grew lighter. Small stories of Mayare's childhood and Pedro's memories on the ranch. Each tale built a bridge between them, a connection that needed no explicit words to be understood. As the moon rose higher, Pedro decided it was time to secure the corral. Mayare watched him as he walked toward the horses, the wind moving his dark hair and letting Pedro's coat ripple gently behind him. Closing the stable door, Pedro heard a different creak, closer. His heart raced. He knew the threat was not entirely dormant and that any lapse could be dangerous. The night still had secrets to reveal, and he was ready. He returned to Mayare, taking a seat in silence. She offered him a piece of bread, a simple gesture, but loaded with humanity and gratitude. Pedro accepted, recognizing in her eyes a mixture of distrust and hope. It was a fragile and powerful moment at the same time. He spoke softly, watching the fire dance across her face. The story of merchants who had passed through the prairie, of cowboys, and their clashes seemed to come alive in Pedro's voice. Mayare listened intently, letting the narration envelop her. In the distance, a wolf howled, breaking the stillness. Pedro and Mayare exchanged a quick glance, remembering they were not alone in the vast expanse. The prairie was beautiful, but relentless, and every creature had its place in the chain of survival. Pedro's coat slid slightly as Mayare adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. It was a small, intimate gesture that needed no words. Pedro felt the warmth of her skin and the softness of her movements, stirring unexpected emotions in his chest. He decided to change the subject to ease the lingering tension. "Do you remember a funny moment from your childhood?" he asked. Mayare closed her eyes, letting out a soft sigh and a memory that made her smile. Stories of races between hills and rivers came to mind. Pedro laughed softly as he listened. The laughter was a strange sound on the ranch, but it brought relief. Mayare's vulnerability and the strength of her character created a fascinating balance, something Pedro had not anticipated when he found her tied to the fallen tree. Uncomfortable silence fell as the night progressed. Pedro stayed watching the fire, feeling the weight of responsibility and the strange attraction to Mayare. The situation was unusual, but the connection forming could not be denied. The wind began to swirl outside the ranch, making the fire spark and the chimney's shadow dance on the walls. Pedro leaned slightly toward Mayare, keeping distance, but feeling the inevitable closeness between them. Mayare settled in the chair, still hugging her knees. Pedro sensed the mixture of fear and curiosity in her eyes, and knew he had to be patient. Every gesture, every glance was a step toward trust he could not force. The night grew quieter. Only the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind filled the room. Pedro felt the tension ease slightly, but not disappear. The threat remained, though momentarily eclipsed by the silent intimacy they shared. Mayare finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said. Pedro felt it, responding with a simple nod. It was a gratitude loaded with meaning, acknowledgement of protection and care. The connection between them grew more tangible with every shared moment. Pedro chose not to break the silence, allowing Mayare to find comfort in his calm and steady presence. The night continued, and with it the sense of relative safety grew, though the shadow of threat always lingered, reminding them that calm was temporary. They sat side by side, each absorbed in their thoughts, feeling that something more than survival united them. Tension gave way to an unexpected sense of closeness and protection. Every movement, every glance, strengthened a silent bond that promised more than friendship. The prairie outside was calm, but Pedro knew the dawn would bring new challenges. Mayar remained quiet, watching the fire, learning to trust little by little. In the dim light, both understood that the night had begun to write a shared story. Dawn arrived slowly over the ranch, painting the sky with shades of orange and violet. Pedro was already up, inspecting the fence line, while the fresh morning air filled his lungs, reminding him that each day brought new risks. Mayare rose carefully, adjusting the blanket over her shoulders. Her gaze settled on the prairie, evaluating the contours of the land and natural escape routes. Pedro watched her, admiring her survival instinct, a blend of Apache wisdom and innate courage. As they prepared breakfast, Pedro noticed how Mayare handled the ranch tools with precision. Every movement was confident, every gesture measured. The skill with which she treated the animals reminded him she was no ordinary woman, but someone accustomed to facing adversity. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small kitchen. Pedro poured it into a metal bowl and handed it to Mayare. She accepted with a gesture of thanks, her dark eyes reflecting a mix of caution and curiosity, assessing Pedro's firm and silent presence. After breakfast, Pedro decided it was time to check the farther fences. Mayar insisted on accompanying him. Together, they mounted their horses, moving across the open prairie. The wind blew through their hair, and the feeling of freedom mingled with the constant tension of possible threats. In the distance, the mountain peaks glimmered in the rising sun. Pedro pointed to a narrow path that seemed less traveled. They had to cross it to inspect the broken fence. Mayare nodded, her hands firm on the reins, showing confidence and determination in each step the horse took. As they advanced, Pedro began to speak of his childhood on the ranch. Stories of lost cattle, unexpected storms, and sleepless nights created a lighter atmosphere. Mayare listened attentively, a subtle smile forming on her lips at the memories of a man who had learned from the land. The landscape seemed endless, but Pedro knew the ranch's safety depended on every detail. He observed how Mayare moved with agility, leaping small obstacles and evaluating each shadow. There was something in her that combined strength and grace, a presence that kept him alert and captivated at the same time. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the calm of the morning. Pedro stopped his horse and raised his hand. Mayare tensed, senses alert. From a nearby bush, a coyote emerged and then vanished into the grass. It was a reminder that the prairie was alive and watchful. They continued, checking each fence post and securing the wire line. Pedro noticed how Mayare leaned to adjust a knot. The strength of her arm blended with delicacy. It was a simple but revealing gesture, someone who could protect herself while caring for others. The sun began to rise, warming the prairie. Pedro and Mayare paused near a creek, letting the horses drink. Mayare leaned over the water, her reflection mingling with the light. Pedro watched her, a silent feeling of respect and admiration growing in his chest. While resting, Pedro asked her about her tribe and her life. Before all this, Mayare spoke calmly, describing rituals, traditions, and her bond with the land. Pedro listened fascinated, understanding that each word carried a story of strength, resilience, and pride. A comfortable silence settled as they both gazed at the horizon. Pedro broke the stillness, commenting on the vastness of the prairie and how each shadow could hide as much danger as beauty. Mayar looked at him, acknowledging the truth in his words, sharing the same sense of constant alertness. They resumed their path toward the damaged fence. Pedro led, but Mayare stayed close, their horses walking in sync. There was a silent dance between them, a trust built step by step, based on mutual respect and the need to stay together in the face of potential threats. Approaching a group of trees, Pedro spotted fresh tracks in the soil. He leaned slightly, pointing them out to Mayare. She nodded, interpreting the signs quickly. They knew someone had passed by not long ago. Adrenaline rose, reminding them they were not alone. They decided to follow the tracks cautiously. Pedro kept his hand near his revolver, but without showing aggression. Mayare watched him, understanding that his protective instinct needed no words to be clear. The tension mixed with closeness strengthened the silent bond they shared. The tracks led them to higher ground with bushes that limited visibility. Pedro whispered instructions, and Mayare moved with agility. Every gesture was calculated. Every shared glance reinforced a wordless communication. The adventure felt more intense, as if the prairie itself was testing them. Suddenly, a flash of metallic light appeared among the bushes. Pedro and Mayare crouched, evaluating the situation. It was a small knife embedded in a tree. The message was clear. Someone else was watching, sending silent warnings. Pedro frowned, realizing Mercer's threat was closer than they imagined. Mayare inhaled deeply, controlling the tension in her chest. Pedro looked at her, and for a moment their hands brushed while adjusting the reins. The contact was brief, but enough to send a silent message. They were in this together, sharing danger and trust increasingly. They continued toward the most damaged part of the fence. Pedro examined each knot and broken plank. Mayare helped with strength and precision, working as a team with him. Their silent action and collaboration forged an unspoken understanding, deeper than any words. Finally, they secured the line carefully, ensuring the animals were protected. Pedro breathed a sigh of relief, though he knew the threat still lingered. Mayare looked at him with a glint in her eyes, a mix of respect and appreciation. The prairie seemed safer, at least for now. Returning to the ranch, the midday sun bathed the dry land. Pedro led the horses, and Mayare followed. They moved with natural coordination, as if their bodies and minds had found a shared rhythm, reinforcing the mutual trust beginning to blossom. Inside the ranch, Pedro prepared water for both and checked the weapons. Mayare watched silently, noting the meticulousness of each action. There was something in the way he cared for the property and for her that stirred deep respect and a growing attraction in Pedro. Finally, they sat before the fireplace, the prairie outside illuminated by the sun. Pedro offered a cup of water to Mayare, and she accepted, finding a moment of calm after the morning's tension. They shared a comfortable silence, full of meaningful glances and mutual understanding. As the afternoon approached, Pedro and Mayare knew the calm would be temporary. Mercer's threat remained present, but the connection forming between them brought hope. Every shared moment, every silent gesture, strengthened a bond that would be crucial for what was to come. The sky began to tint with reddish hues as Pedro and Mayare once again left the ranch, prepared to explore the northern slope. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine, reminding them that nature was as beautiful as it was relentless. Pedro adjusted his horse's saddle while Mayare watched him closely. Every movement of hers was calculated, reflecting years of experience on the prairie. Her gaze remained steady, and in it, Pedro saw not only strength but a curiosity that defied any imposed limits. Arriving at a nearby canyon, they both descended slowly. The shadows of the rock walls stretched long, creating an atmosphere of mystery and danger. Pedro felt tension run down his back, but Mayare seemed at home, assessing each stone and potential hiding place with native instinct. As they advanced, an eagle crossed the sky above them, letting out a powerful cry that echoed through the canyon. Pedro looked at Mayare, and she smiled with a flash of admiration. The connection between them grew silently but intensely, like the wind blowing through the rocks. Pedro decided to stop by a clear stream flowing between the stones. They dismounted, letting the horses graze. Mayare leaned over the water, observing her reflection, while Pedro watched her. Every gesture of hers seemed to capture the essence of her indomitable spirit. Suddenly, a strange sound made them lift their heads. Broken leaves and moved branches indicated the presence of someone else. Pedro placed his hand on his revolver, while Mayare positioned herself strategically behind a rock. Her dark eyes showed alertness and determination, ready for whatever came. A rider appeared in the distance, moving quickly through the shadows. Pedro assessed the situation, recognizing the figure as a stranger. Mayare prepared to intervene if necessary. Tension rose, and the air seemed charged with a danger both knew could change everything. The rider passed nearby without stopping, leaving a tacit message. The prairie was being watched. Pedro frowned, realizing Mercer was near, sending silent warnings. Mayare nodded, her face showing a mix of distrust and resolve, ready to face whatever came together. They continued descending toward a narrow path winding through the canyon. Pedro led, but Mayare stayed close, evaluating every shadow and every movement of the ground. Their horses advanced carefully, aware that any misstep could be dangerous in that treacherous terrain. The sound of the stream grew stronger, mixing with birdsong. Pedro looked at Mayare and smiled softly, trying to ease the tension. She responded with a barely perceptible gesture, enough for him to understand that they shared a silent understanding, forged in danger and adventure. Arriving at a small cave, Pedro suggested they rest for a moment. Mayare entered cautiously, examining the interior. The cave offered shelter but also reminded them that they could be surprised. Pedro watched, admiring how every movement of hers was confident and calculated, reflecting years of survival. While resting, Mayare spoke of her travels through the region, describing safe routes and secret hideouts. Pedro listened, fascinated by the combination of native knowledge and courage she displayed. Every word was a reminder that the woman before him was extraordinary and unique. The sun began to decline, casting long shadows over the cave. Pedro and Mayare moved with coordination, preparing a small temporary shelter. Their gestures and glances reflected a trust that strengthened with each shared moment as the adventure continued beyond the ranch's safety. Suddenly, a dull noise drew their attention. Pedro leaned slightly, pointing toward the cave entrance. Mayare understood instantly and moved quickly, ready to act. The sound came from a small group of frightened servants, but the tension did not lessen. They emerged again, moving toward a clearing where the sunset bathed the prairie in light. Pedro and Mayare remained calm, observing the terrain carefully. Every shadow seemed to hide stories, and every sound could signal danger. The adrenaline mixed with silent attraction, creating a palpable bond. Pedro spoke about the importance of staying alert as they traversed the region. Mayare nodded. Her gaze was firm and determined. Every instruction was followed with precision, demonstrating not only respect, but an implicit understanding that strengthened their improvised team and the growing connection between them. As they advanced along a rocky path, Pedro stumbled slightly on a root. Mayare extended her hand to help him, and their fingers brushed. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through both of them. Pedro blushed, and Mayare held her gaze, aware of the spark that had ignited. They stopped beside a cliff overlooking the valley. Pedro and Mayare contemplated the landscape, the prairie illuminated by the golden sunlight. There was beauty and danger intertwined, a reminder that the adventure they shared was not only physical but also emotional, stirring deep feelings. The wind blew strongly, moving hair and blankets. Pedro leaned slightly toward Mayare, adjusting her cloak as she watched the horizon. The contact was brief, but enough to convey care and a growing interest. A silent romance beginning to blossom amid the adventure. As they descended to the canyon's lower part, they heard a metallic noise. Pedro and Mayare stopped immediately, assessing every possibility. Once again, the prairie proved alive, and any misstep could put them at risk. Their synchronization, however, kept them alert and prepared. They found a hidden trail leading to a small stream. Pedro suggested following it to return to the ranch. Mayare nodded, and together they moved cautiously, their horses in sync. Each step strengthened mutual trust and the silent understanding forming between them. Approaching the ranch, the twilight illuminated the wooden structures. Pedro and Mayare dismounted, observing the safety of the place. There was temporary calm, but both knew Mercer's threat remained, reminding them that every moment of tranquility was precious and fleeting. Inside the ranch, Pedro checked the weapons again, while Mayare prepared a place to rest. The atmosphere was charged with tension, but also with a growing, silent connection. Every gesture, every shared glance, increased intimacy without words, reinforcing a nascent bond. As night fell, Pedro and Mayare sat near the fireplace, listening to the crackling of the fire. The prairie outside darkened, but inside there was a sense of safety and closeness. Their hands brushed lightly, and both understood that what was emerging between them was more than a simple adventure. Before sleeping, Pedro looked at Mayare with respect and admiration. She returned his gaze with a faint smile, showing trust and complicity. The night was calm, but the promise of challenges and romance grew, leaving a suspense both felt in the air, anticipating what was to come. Dawn arrived silently over the ranch, with a starry sky faintly illuminating the fields. Pedro adjusted his hat and checked the outer fence, while Mayare scanned the distance. Her eyes reflected alertness, aware that every shadow could hide danger or surprise. Pedro decided to explore a path leading to a nearby canyon, searching for signs of unusual movement. Mayare followed with steady steps, her hair waving in the wind. Each step revealed the untamed beauty of the region, but also the constant risk lurking behind every rock. As they descended into the canyon, they heard the whisper of a river hidden among the trees. Pedro pointed to the water, suggesting they could rest and refill their supplies. Mayare smiled softly, appreciating Pedro's attentiveness. Their closeness felt natural, a silent bond, strengthening with each moment. While drinking from the stream, a servant appeared from the undergrowth. Pedro raised his hand to warn Mayare, and she stepped back cautiously. Their eyes met for an instant, and a faint blush crossed both their faces, reminding them that attraction was growing amid adventure and danger. Pedro heard a crack behind them and turned quickly. Mayare instinctively positioned herself in front of him, ready to act. The tension enveloped them, but also strengthened their connection. Each protective gesture increased mutual trust, creating a silent, powerful bond. The crack proved to be a curious fox observing them before disappearing into the bushes. Pedro exhaled, and Mayare laughed softly, easing the momentary tension. Mayare's laughter had an unexpected effect on Pedro, sending a deep warmth through his chest. They continued along a narrow path bordering the river. The wet, slippery stones demanded concentration. Pedro briefly took Mayare's hand to help her cross, and the electricity of the touch was immediate. Both averted their gaze, but the spark lingered between them. Reaching a small waterfall, Pedro and Mayare paused to admire the majesty of the place. The falling water produced a constant roar, yet also a moment of calm. Pedro observed Mayare, recognizing not only strength but a passion for life that fascinated him. Pedro decided to explore a narrow trail winding through dense bushes. Mayare followed confidently, evaluating each step. The adventure kept them alert and alive, and each challenge seemed to draw them closer, combining instinct, courage, and a silent attraction that grew with every shared moment. A crow cawed in the distance, and Pedro raised his hand to warn Mayare. The Apache woman nodded, understanding the silent signal. They moved with coordination, like a single entity, aware that danger could appear at any moment, reminding them of the fragility of security. Reaching a clearing, Pedro pointed to recent horse tracks. Mayare bent to inspect them, confirming they were not theirs. The presence of others was imminent. Pedro clenched his fist, and Mayare placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture conveying silent understanding and complicity. They decided to advance cautiously, following the direction of the tracks. Every rock and bush was examined carefully. Pedro watched Mayare move with precision, admiring the combination of beauty and strength she possessed. Their eyes met, sharing a look loaded with understanding. The wind brought a strange scent, mixing earth, pine, and distant smoke. Pedro stopped, sniffing the air. Mayare crouched behind a rock, ready to react. The tension intensified, but so did the thrill. Every shared challenge strengthened their bond, transforming the adventure into something deeper. A shadow moved swiftly among the trees. Pedro pointed, and Mayare moved nimbly, assessing the situation. Emerging, the intruder turned out to be an injured traveler asking for help. Pedro and Mayare exchanged glances before deciding to intervene, aware that their humanity outweighed any caution. They helped the man rest by a bush. Pedro examined his wounds, while Mayare fetched clean water from the nearby river. Their silent, efficient cooperation demonstrated the connection they had forged, a balance of strength, instinct, and an emerging romance growing with every shared act. The traveler spoke weakly, recounting encounters with bandits on the prairie. Pedro listened carefully as Mayare assessed the information. Every detail was crucial for anticipating potential threats. The adventure united them further, and the constant sense of danger combined with their proximity increased the intensity between them. They decided to continue together, helping the man advance slowly. Pedro led, watching every shadow. Mayare followed, her gaze alert and her hand near her revolver. The air was charged with tension, but also with a silent closeness that both felt deeply impossible to ignore. The path led to a small hill from which they could survey the prairie. Pedro pointed to a distant camp, possibly belonging to bandits. Mayare inhaled deeply, evaluating the distance and possible risks. The combination of danger and adventure stirred intense emotions, blending adrenaline and silent desire. Pedro decided they should approach stealthily. Mayare nodded, and they moved slowly, using the cover of bushes and rocks. Each step required perfect coordination. The touch of their hands adjusting their weapons was subtle, but loaded with meaning, strengthening a bond that transcended words. Approaching the camp, Pedro and Mayare heard muffled murmurs and laughter. They remained calm, observing patterns and movements. Strategy became essential, and every gesture of Mayare revealed her intelligence and bravery. Pedro admired the synchrony of her actions, consolidating respect and attraction equally. Pedro tossed a small stone to distract a sentry. Mayare seized the opportunity to move swiftly and cover a strategic point. Tension rose, but so did the shared excitement. Both knew that every challenge faced together strengthened their mutual trust and the connection that was beginning to transform into romance. The sentry moved distractedly, allowing them to advance closer to the camp. Pedro and Mayare exchanged a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement of their synchrony. The sense of proximity and complicity grew, as every shadow of the camp became a challenge they faced with courage and caution. They finally found a safe spot to observe and plan their next move. Pedro exhaled deeply, feeling adrenaline mixed with a silent fascination for Mayare. She leaned slightly against his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of the contact, a touch that said more than words. The sky darkened, and the night brought new possibilities and risks. Pedro and Mayare moved carefully toward a nearby shelter, keeping their charge safe. Each step reinforced their trust and bond, blending adventure, danger, and a romance growing silently. Upon reaching the shelter, they secured the perimeter and checked on the traveler. The sense of safety was temporary, but necessary. Pedro and Mayare shared a brief moment of silence, a pause allowing for looks charged with emotion. The attraction between them was evident, though subtle, a romance advancing with intensity. As night deepened, Pedro and Mayare sat near the makeshift fire, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Their hands brushed accidentally while adjusting blankets and supplies, and both smiled. The warmth of the contact, combined with the day's adrenaline, made it clear that their bond was deepening. The night enveloped the prairie as Pedro and Mayare moved stealthily toward the bandits' camp. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. The air smelled of gunpowder and damp earth. Tension mixed with an adrenaline that electrified their senses and hearts. Pedro stopped and pointed to a group gathered around the fire. Mayare crouched, studying the bandits' movements. Her eyes shone with determination and caution. Pedro admired Mayare's bravery. Every gesture of hers demonstrated strength, intelligence, and courage that impressed him deeply. As they advanced, an unexpected shout echoed in the distance. They quickly exchanged glances, evaluating the situation. Pedro took the lead, guiding Mayare towards safe cover. Their physical closeness generated a silent heat, a spark emerging amidst the adrenaline of their shared mission. Mayare slid a stone toward the fire, causing a small burst of sparks that distracted the bandits. Pedro seized the moment to move closer, keeping his breathing controlled. Every synchronized action between them reinforced their trust and awakened a deeper sense of silent connection. The bandits began to reorganize, sensing that something was wrong. Pedro and Mayare exchanged a brief glance before slipping behind a bush. The touch of their hands as they crossed the shrub barrier sent an unexpected shiver through them, a sign of the growing attraction between them. "From relative safety," Pedro whispered instructions, and Mayare obeyed with precision. Their coordination was perfect, born of mutual trust and instinctive understanding. The risk of being discovered heightened the tension, but also intensified their bond, blending adventure and romance irresistibly. Pedro spotted a route that would bring them closer to the heart of the camp. Mayare followed silently, admiring his leadership and strategy. Each calculated step revealed the mix of strength and vulnerability they both shared, creating a feeling of silent intimacy, a non-verbal language that spoke directly to their emotions. They approached a shed where the bandits stored weapons. Pedro signaled for Mayare to stay behind while he inspected. The tension of the moment kept them alert, yet aware of each other's proximity. The accidental brush of their arms ignited an intense heat they could barely ignore. Pedro found a small arsenal and examined it carefully. Mayare watched from the shadows, admiring his focus and determination. Every gesture of Pedro sparked a mix of respect and desire in her, a silent romance unfolding amid the danger and adrenaline of their shared mission. A noise behind the shed made them both spin instantly. 2 bandits appeared unexpectedly, and Pedro reacted quickly. Mayare drew her knife, moving with a skill that surprised Pedro. Together they faced the threat, the synchronicity of their movements demonstrating trust and a chemistry that went beyond the physical. After neutralizing the intruders, Pedro and Mayare exchanged a glance charged with emotion. Their breaths were deep and ragged. The recent danger brought them closer, combining courage, admiration, and attraction in a moment neither would forget. The adventure had turned them into inseparable allies. They continued forward, more cautious than ever. Every shadow was evaluated, every sound interpreted. Pedro and Mayare communicated with minimal gestures, a secret language born of necessity and trust. Their connection deepened, blending romance and danger in a tangible and thrilling way. Reaching the center of the camp, Pedro observed the bandits distracted by cards and drinks. Mayare moved stealthily to inspect the situation. Her ability to move undetected impressed Pedro, reinforcing his attraction and respect for the Apache woman accompanying him on this dangerous mission. Pedro decided they needed to create a distraction to escape with valuable information. Mayare nodded, understanding without words. Together, they threw stones and made strategic noises that disoriented the bandits. The synchronicity of their actions reflected years of instinctive training, and their physical closeness heightened the intensity of each shared gesture. While the bandits ran toward the noise, Pedro and Mayare seized the opportunity to take necessary weapons and important documents. Their hands brushed as they gathered objects, sending a silent surge of emotion through both. They smiled at each other, aware that their bond went far beyond the mission. Pedro pointed to an escape route toward a safe trail along the hillside. Mayare followed, keeping constant vigilance. The constant sense of danger and the proximity of the other created an atmosphere charged with tension and desire. A romance developing with each step, each movement. Descending the trail, Pedro tripped over a root, and Mayare held him firmly. The unexpected closeness left them breathless. Their eyes met, and a telling silence spoke for them. Risk and adventure intensified emotions that both were beginning to embrace. Finally, they found a safe place to stop and check the weapons and documents. Pedro and Mayare shared a brief respite, sitting close to each other. Their hands brushed deliberately this time, a gesture consolidating the romantic tension that had grown through every shared challenge. Mayare spoke softly, suggesting a plan to protect the information and return to the ranch. Pedro listened attentively, admiring her intelligence and determination. Every shared word reinforced their complicity, a bond blending adventure, strategy, and a silent romance that felt inevitable. As they moved toward a nearby forest, Pedro ensured the injured traveler followed safely. Mayare led the way with sharpness, each step reflecting training and bravery. The connection between them was palpable, a mix of respect, attraction, and fascination growing with every shared moment. The sound of an owl accompanied them, and the night felt deeper, more intense. Pedro and Mayare remained alert, but the occasional brush of their arms reminded them that their bond strengthened even in darkness. The combination of danger and closeness heightened the silent passion between them. Reaching a stream to rest and refill, Pedro and Mayare shared a brief, tension-filled moment. The proximity of their bodies, the adrenaline, and the excitement of the day created an unspoken intimacy, a prelude to what their relationship was beginning to promise. As the moon illuminated their faces, Pedro leaned toward Mayare and whispered words of recognition and admiration. She smiled shyly, feeling the weight of the moment. The adventure had forged an intense bond, and the romantic closeness between them was inevitable, growing, and captivating. They settled to spend the night, securing the perimeter and keeping watch. The brush of their hands and the closeness of their bodies offered both comfort and tension. Every challenge faced together had transformed their relationship, blending romance, respect, and silent passion. Before dawn, Pedro and Mayare discussed plans to return to the ranch safely. Every strategy was meticulous, every movement calculated. Trust between them had grown beyond the mission, and the excitement of their romantic bond began to manifest in gestures, glances, and subtle touches. The sky turned pink, announcing a new day. Pedro and Mayare prepared to descend to the prairie, carrying the recovered information and a shared sense of triumph. The adventure had united them, and the silent romance that had emerged promised to continue beyond the mission. The sunrise bathed the prairie in golden light as Pedro and Mayare advanced toward the ranch with the recovered information. Their bodies were tired, but the invincible spirit they shared pushed them forward. Each step reinforced their bond, a mixture of adventure, respect, and silent romance. Mayare watched the horizon, feeling the wind on her face and the quickening beat of her heart. Pedro noticed her gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Their hands brushed along the sides of their bodies, sending a current of restrained tension and desire. Approaching a familiar path, Pedro remembered the dangers that could still lurk. His senses remained alert, and Mayare mirrored him with precision. Every gesture, every movement showed perfect coordination, born of mutual trust and the attraction growing between them, silent but palpable. A sound in the bushes made them pause. Pedro placed a hand over Mayare's, signaling calm. Their eyes met, and both understood that any moment could be decisive. The mix of danger and closeness created a magnetism impossible to ignore, intense and electric. Emerging from the bushes, they encountered a small group of outlaws attempting to ambush them. Pedro and Mayare reacted instinctively. Their movements were precise, synchronized. Every gesture showed courage and skill, but also the intimacy that had developed between them. A romance born of shared adrenaline. After neutralizing the intruders, they took refuge behind a boulder. They breathed heavily, pulses racing from the fight and the proximity of the other. Pedro leaned toward Mayare and whispered words of relief and admiration. She responded with a gaze filled with gratitude and desire. They continued through a seemingly endless forest. The tension was constant, but so was the silent chemistry between them. Every accidental touch, every brush of arms reinforced the bond. Pedro admired Mayare's determination and skill, and she found security in his strength. They reached a river that offered a brief respite. Pedro helped Mayare across the slippery stones. Their hands intertwined momentarily, and the electricity between them was impossible to ignore. The adventure had awakened a romance neither could deny, even if not yet fully expressed. On the other side of the river, they spotted a path leading to the ranch. Pedro and Mayare exchanged a look, aware that the hardest part was over, yet knowing that every shared second strengthened a bond deeper than any fear. Excitement was tangible in every gesture. The return to the ranch was not simple. They had to avoid patrols and traps. Pedro led, and Mayare followed with precision and confidence. Each step was a dance of strategy and closeness. Their glances met frequently, and with every exchange, the silent romance grew, fueled by adrenaline and mutual admiration. When they saw the silhouette of the ranch, relief was immediate. But so was the awareness that their adventure had changed something between them. Pedro lowered his guard, and Mayare moved closer, their physical closeness reflecting the emotional connection cultivated during the mission. They hid behind a fence to ensure everything was secure. Pedro took a deep breath, and Mayare placed her hand on his arm. The contact, brief as it was, conveyed silent trust, gratitude, and affection that had become impossible to ignore. They decided to enter the ranch under the protection of the first rays of sunlight. Each step brought them closer to safety, but also reinforced their complicity. The prior tension transformed into a warm, comforting feeling, a prelude to the slowly solidifying romance. Inside the ranch, they shared a moment of silence while organizing what they had recovered. Pedro and Mayare exchanged a knowing smile, aware they had survived the adventure together. Their gazes reflected pride, excitement, and a growing desire that needed no words. Mayar suggested securing the weapons and documents before resting. Pedro nodded, admiring her intelligence and quickness. Every gesture, every word, strengthened the silent intimacy between them. Mutual respect and admiration had sown the seeds of a deep, genuine romance. After finishing their task, Pedro and Mayare sat under a nearby tree to regain strength. The breeze brushed their faces, and their hands touched lightly. Every contact evoked the connection they had cultivated in each shared moment of danger, a bond that went beyond the physical. Pedro looked into Mayare's eyes and saw her courage and determination reflected. She, in turn, found in Pedro the strength, protection, and passion that fascinated her. The adventure had united their destinies, and romance emerged inevitably amid trust and overcome danger. The afternoon passed as they shared stories and memories of the journey. Pedro and Mayare laughed, exchanging jokes and soft words. The mission's tension turned into warm complicity, and intimacy between them grew, blending romance, excitement, and camaraderie. They prepared to secure the ranch and the recovered information. Pedro watched Mayare work with admiration. Every gesture showed skill and grace, and the connection between them deepened. The mix of romance and adventure had created a bond no danger could break. As they secured the surroundings, Pedro and Mayare shared a brief moment of meaningful eye contact. No words were necessary. Everything had been said through gestures and looks. The mission's excitement, the danger overcome, and physical closeness consolidated their silent romance. With the ranch finally secure, Pedro took Mayare's hand and held it tightly, aware of all they had experienced together. She responded with a shy smile, and in that moment, adventure and romance merged into a deep, irreversible bond. Twilight arrived as they sat by the main ranch gate. Pedro and Mayare shared a moment of tranquility, watching the horizon. Tension had given way to calm, and the romance born between them glowed like a silent flame, ready to grow. Mayare rested her head on Pedro's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. The physical closeness was comforting, but also a silent declaration of what they had discovered. A deep connection, born from danger, shared adventure, and passion. Pedro whispered words of affection, and Mayare responded softly. Their intimacy became tangible, a mix of respect, desire, and tenderness. Every gesture, every look reminded them that their bond went beyond any mission or challenge faced together. As night covered the prairie, Pedro and Mayare prepared to rest. The closeness of their bodies was a comfort after the day's tension. Romance had flourished amid danger, and both knew their experiences had bound them forever. The night's silence was broken only by their synchronized breaths. Pedro and Mayare shared one last moment of contact before closing their eyes. The adventure had ended, but the romantic, intense, and silent bond promised to continue far beyond the next dawn.